everybody. Don't make me put the lights out again. I hope you had a good lunch, and thank you for coming back for the second session today, which is going to be a great one. I'm very happy to introduce, excuse me, David James, who's Professor of Social Sciences, Professor in the School of Social Sciences at Cardiff University, and Director of the ESRC Doctoral Training Centre in Wales, and also a leading light in the British Journal of Sociology of Education. And as you can probably gather from that, David has been a very prominent voice in both empirical studies of social conditions of schooling and in developing good theory in order to understand the workings of schools and education at all levels, up to vocational education. And today he's going to talk a bit about his work in Bourdieu, which is very much an ongoing project. He has a book out some time ago called Bourdieu and Education, Acts of Practical Theory. And that book is still, I think, a kind of canonical text on bringing Bourdieu to bear on education. So we're very, very pleased to have him talk a bit more about that today. I should also say that David's book that he has co-written with Diane Ray and Joe Crozier, White Middle Class Identities in Urban Schooling, is about to have a second edition. Yeah, and again, a very influential book that lots of people find very helpful in getting to grips with the social and cultural context of schooling. So great to have David here today, and he's going to be talking about recognizing misrecognition for Bourdieu and Fraser and why it matters. Thank you, David.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that introduction. It really is an honour to be asked to come and speak, and I'm delighted to do it. Of course, I thought I'd escape work for a week, coming here, but I'm afraid some work caught up with me, so I spent some of the morning doing a really boring job, thinking how nice the afternoon would be. So I hope I was right. So let's get moving. I want to say a few things which I hope will be helpful, especially helpful if you're relatively new to trying to use theory, trying to harness conceptual material or ideas or theoretical tools for an empirical research project. And I hope to do that by trying to get right inside the process, right inside an example, at least one example, of how a powerful conceptual tool, developed of course elsewhere, not out of thin air, but through empirical work, can be taken by you and brought into your own project and made to work. So that's the premise. And there's a few other things around that as well. I'll try not to vomit on you, although yesterday I thought that was quite a good metaphor for the sort of lack of structure I feel at the moment. So we'll see. Yeah, we'll see. Okay. 4 things I want to try and say something about. One is, what does Nancy Fraser mean by misrecognition? Secondly, what does Pierre Bourdieu mean by misrecognition? I think these are both really, really important concepts and useful, but I think that there's some important differences which it's useful to tease out. Thirdly, I want to share a few examples of thinking with Bourdieu's concepts, and by telling you a bit about the research project that's reported in the book that Maggie kindly mentioned, and this is it. It's published by Palgrave, and they've at last listened to us, and they're going to bring it out in paperback this summer. So not quite yet, it's nearly here. So I'm looking forward to that. And lastly, I want to say a few words about reflexivity, because I think that project, combined with mainly Bourdieusian thinking tools, really exposes what I call the discomfort of the educational researcher. Okay, so that's the sort of agenda. So a little bit of a sort of whistle-stop tour of some very important ideas, and I hope not to oversimplify too much. I think the first thing to say about Nancy Fraser's integrated theory of justice, as it's sometimes known, is that it's really useful, that it's concerned with inequality and injustice, And it's an attempt to cope with theorizing inequality and social and injustice in a global context. Essentially, we have, in a global context, the challenge of the nation state as a unit for understanding inequality, for understanding lots of things actually, yet it remains as an important sort of division, a way of carving up the world, as it were. And to cope with that, what Nancy Fraser does very helpfully is to point to two types, to start with anyway, of injustice. And these are not sort of categorical things. You can't say, right, here's some injustice, is it that or is it that? They are rather two sort of lenses on injustice. They're two ends of a continuum where for most practical purposes, any injustice will have elements of both. And they are maldistribution and misrecognition. And there's this insistence always that we look at how they're both implicated or imbricated in any situation, which Fraser calls bivalence. So, as you might expect, the first of those, maldistribution, is an idea about economic inequalities in the main. It's rooted in the economic system of modern capitalism, and there are mechanisms like forms of exploitation, economic marginalisation, other denials of certain levels of living or opportunities to live in certain ways. At the other end of the continuum, the second idea, misrecognition, for Fraser, is rooted in the cultural and the symbolic. And this, she says, may be produced where there is cultural domination, a lack of recognition, or routine disrespect of one sort or another. Now, Fraser went on to elaborate this framework in very helpful ways and to focus on the political dimension. I'm not going to go into that here at the moment, or we could later if you want to, but the point I want to make is that there's a very clear meaning to this term, especially with the rise of identity politics and the conception of inequality via identity politics. One can grasp something of the interaction between that and the economic through Fraser's framework, and very usefully so. But I want to contrast that with what Pierre Bourdieu means by misrecognition, and I think this is quite an important distinction. And it's one that there was a terrific book called Misrecognition, Social Inequality and Social Justice, edited by Terry Lovell, which is a terrific book, but I feel this is its sort of weak point, the thing it doesn't do and it needs to do, or should have done. So what's the similarity, what's the difference? Well, let's just start with a little reminder of the sort of approach that Bourdieu promotes or sets out. There are some well-known or certainly regularly heard concepts like field, various forms of capital, habitus, social practice and doxa. I don't want to go through an explanation of all these at the moment, although again we could come back to that if you wish. But I want to suggest that straight away, grasping Bourdieu, it's a bit like we were saying yesterday with some other theories. You can't just take field, off the shelf and then use it on its own as if it were sort of complete. It comes with the rest. It comes with the approach to the social world that Bourdieu is kind of advocating, so as a means or a set of understanding. So field, let's just take that for a minute. Field is not this kind of field, okay? The one you can see, it's not that kind of field at all. It's this kind of field. This kind of field is really the simple idea, actually, that any individual or relationship is sure, it's going to be agentic. We've all got agency, but it's going to be pretty highly shaped as well by where it sits, by where it's been, by what it's sitting against and what it's sitting with. So the shift to field is terribly important in Bourdieu's whole sort of advocacy of certain kinds of thinking tools. And my favourite sort of analogy there actually is that is that Bourdieu's field represents the same sort of shift that went on in physics when you go from Newtonian mechanics, where individual forces and individual objects bump against each other. From that, you go to Einsteinian physics, where the relationships are just as important as the things. So it's that shift, you know, a relational social science. So, you know, that little compass at the top there, well, it's still a compass and it can spin, but, you know, it doesn't have much choice at the moment. So it's a nice balance between the agentic and so on. And I think it's worth mentioning, too, that some of these other concepts are regularly confused with other concepts. So, for example, Bourdieu's notion of social capital is very different to the notions of social capital that you find usually in social policy, which have their roots in Coleman or Putnam or Fukuyama. All of them very interesting, actually, but very different to Bourdieu's notion of social capital, which is, as a form of capital, is a relational one, which you can only, as it were, know against other holdings of certain stakes in certain fields. So, you know, it's very, very difficult to operationalise, of course. And lastly, I'd mention too, perhaps, in any Cook's tour of some of these concepts, that Bourdieu is very, very interested in how, as individuals, we acquire and carry the social into other situations, into other settings, and as it were, reproduce the structures that we've been through in the past, and those structures, as it were, in turn shape new occasions. There are some overlaps between Bourdieu and Fraser. Both, for example, both theorists are passionate about trying to reduce social inequality. And there's definitely a very big overlap between Fraser's notion of misrecognition and Bourdieu's notion of symbolic violence. Bourdieu, you know, writes at length about symbolic violence and its significance, its importance for understanding the social world. And you know, this is, I mean, an example of symbolic violence would be how perhaps the state has the capacity to impose a definition on a category of person or a group that may be pejorative. We've seen some splendid examples of that, haven't we, with things like people that claim benefits, or at various times professional groups, social workers, teachers, at other times single parents, particularly women. So symbolic violence, very useful concept, very close to Nancy Fraser's notion of misrecognition and the sort of harms that can result. Okay. But misrecognition also has a more central meaning in Bourdieu's work, and one which I would argue is very helpful for us, for people doing practical, empirical work that wants to be theoretically informed about situations like educational ones. So let's see what I might mean by that. Now, for Bourdieu to get sort of Bourdieu's notion of misrecognition, you have to go to see what it's associated with. And in Bourdieu's writing, there are these three concepts which are roughly translated as knowledge, recognition, and misrecognition. First of all, connaissance. This isn't just knowledge, you know, just knowing stuff. It's about a sens pratique. It's about the being in a social situation and having the sense of practice in that situation, in the social world. I mean, I would argue, for example, that if you went and got my brother who's 8 years older than me, he's never been in a university, you sort of brought him in here and sat him there, okay, he would be extremely uncomfortable. Not just a bit, but extremely uncomfortable. And that's because he doesn't know how to be in this situation. And pretty much all of you do, okay, I would imagine anyway. So, I mean, even that little example, it's an absolutely crucial form of social knowledge, connaissance. Now, when Borgia says, in his famous definition of habitus, that when a habitus encounters a world with which it's familiar, he's talking about dispositions and past experience, it is as a fish in water. And that's recognition, that's reconnaissance. So recognizing a social situation, having as it were, a repertoire and a disposition that brings you into a relationship with that situation is reconnaissance. And finally, méconnaissance. Misrecognition is a poor translation of this, because what it really means, as it says here, is it means how practices are made invisible through a displacement of understanding and a reconstrual as part of other aspects of the habitus that go without saying. Now, I thought I'd illustrate this with a recent news item. I meant to photograph this and put it on a slide, but I ran out of time. The headline on this piece from The Observer, one of our Sunday newspapers here, is Tories Sarah Palin. She's taken the role of Sarah Palin in the view of the writer, in by-election row after state school jibe provokes fury. Quite a difficult headline to read, that one. Essentially, this is about a Tory candidate in the Eastleigh by-election recently, called Maria Hutchins, and she was standing for election, and she was asked about where her son might be going to school, secondary school, and she said, William, my son is very gifted, which gives us another interesting challenge in finding the right sort of education for him. Impossible in the state system. Now, only 10% of kids go to private secondary schools, roughly speaking, in the UK. She said later, when asked why this might be, she said, well, he wants to be an eminent surgeon, and if he's going to be an eminent surgeon, then there's no way that he'll get there if he goes to a state school. Now, that sounds like a bit of sort of boring right-wing prejudice, really, but it's actually more than that. It's misrecognition. It's an attribution to another realm of meaning of something deemed natural. I think there's some better examples, in fact some more accessible examples that I'd like to share with you. And we might come back to that one if you like. I don't know if you've ever seen a British programme called Downton Abbey, or if you live in many other European countries, you might have seen Dinner for One, which is shown every year. Has anyone seen Dinner for One? A couple of you have, okay. If you lived in Germany, you would be very familiar with it. This is slightly flippant, but I just want to say that these programmes, which are very popular, are one of the reasons they're popular, I think, is they play with a form of misrecognition. They play with the tension between immense differences in power and character. So this, in the first photograph there, you have the butler, the faithful butler, and the head of the household, the dignitary who owns the house, and the butler thinks he's wonderful, and is extremely grateful to him for all the care he shows to the butler, and what this does is it, genuinely there is a good relationship between the two, but it continually erases the economic relationship on a daily basis. So that would be a form of misrecognition. I'd like to share another one with you. Now I chose the baby because babies sort of speak of innocence, don't they, in classic terms, I suppose. There's a mobile phone, that's what it's about really, not the baby. There's a mobile phone, it's a thing on which you make calls, yeah? But it's not just that, is it? Increasingly, it is a tracking and consumer behaviour data collection point. If anyone, if you ever use applications on a phone, on a smartphone that involve mapping and position, if, for example, you buy an iPhone and tell it where you are, which it invites you to do as soon as you set it up, thereafter enormous amounts of data are being collected about you and what you do and where you are. This data, of course, is being collected for a purpose, because it costs money to collect data, and all sorts of things are being done with that data, and more things will be done with that data. I think the point about misrecognition here is that people think they're just using a mobile phone on the whole. They occasionally get surprised when it tells them there's a Starbucks around the corner, or have they considered, this? And you could say the same about, Gmail and a whole host of other things. But my favourite example of everyday misrecognition is signalled by this picture, which is about bees gathering nectar, but perhaps more directly by this picture, which I took in a Sainsbury's last summer, a large supermarket. With this example, it actually says on that sign, something for nothing, doesn't it? Get yourself the next card, something for nothing. And for the most part, that's how it feels. People show their nectar card every time they go shopping. It gets scanned, they get points, they get sort of rewarded for buying their shopping, and they can spend the points on future occasions. That's what it seems to be going on. But what is actually going on? Well, something quite different is going on. What's really going on, of course, is that a company to which this supermarket signed up is systematically collecting vast amounts of data, quite intimate data, on purchasing habits. They might, for example, notice that, like a lot of people, I occasionally buy a bottle of Rioja, Spanish red wine. It's probably fashionable about 10 years ago, but anyway, I buy it sometimes. Okay, and that at the same time, I and people like me tend to buy, coffee, fresh ground coffee, fair trade, of course. And furthermore, they might notice how much people like me spend, every week or month or wherever it is, how often we go, what time we go, what sorts of things we tend to buy, what sorts of things we tend to buy in small amounts at other times. Now you start to build that up, and what you have is a fantastically powerful database for selling more stuff, for, in a sense, more intelligent marketing. So what's happening really with the Nectar card is I'm not getting something for nothing, I'm selling my information to Nectar and to Sainsbury's, who will then use it to make more profit out of me. Now that's just an everyday example of misrecognition, but what it does rather well is to illustrate that misrecognition is sort of relies on people half knowing, not quite knowing what's going on, and is very, that I think is very close to Bourdieu's wish to do away with some very common binaries, like conscious, unconscious. We sort of half know a lot of things, and we behave as if we half know a lot of things. So, okay, let's just put a line under that and get back to how misrecognition works in a research project. I'd start this by suggesting that with common sense, and I include policy common sense in this, there's a lot of trouble with common sense. One is that common sense has it that educational achievements are somehow neutral and a reflection of innate ability plus effort, perhaps part of a meritocracy. They're also, that's the qualifications or credentials, are also seen as a product of school quality and teacher quality. Common sense has it that educational credentials sum up capacity, intelligence, and so on. I've used my brother already, I'll use him again. He didn't do very well at school at all, but he's one of the brightest people I've ever met. Really. And I think that there's a habitual assumption, actually this is promoted by education professionals of course as well, that what they measure is it. I would suggest that actually it's not as simple as that. Okay, so all these assumptions are highly questionable. For Bourdieu, the classic case of misrecognition is about educational credentials. This is a quote from Bourdieu. He says, misrecognition of the social determinants of the educational career and therefore of the social trajectory it helps to determine gives the educational certificate the value of natural right and makes the education system one of the fundamental agencies of the maintenance of the social order. Well, I was involved in a couple of research projects actually that were part informed anyway by a Bourdieusian approach, and I'd like to say a little bit about one of those, and in particular how the concept of misrecognition for Bourdieu proved so useful in our analysis. I first need to tell you a little bit about that project. So it was a study called Identity, Education, Choice in the White Urban Middle Classes. It was an investigation of a cross-section of people, families who'd made against the grain school choices, and by that we meant families that had choices of different secondary schools, deliberately choosing average or below average performing secondaries, usually the local comprehensive, which if you know anything about the UK system, and if you, I'm sure many of you do, know quite a bit about the pressures of neoliberalism and markets and choice, it's quite a difficult choice to make. Because everything in the system, the information in the system would suggest that these schools are not as good. Okay, what did we do? We interviewed parents and children in 125 households. This sort of study, you had to get close to people's experiences, and if possible you have to triangulate them if you can, if you want to understand, you know, what students think, the young people think and their parents think, and then put the two together. So London and 2 other cities. I'll give you a couple of sort of examples of the sorts of things we found overall. Just to give a flavour really, before we get on to the more specific thing. So, a couple of general things first. The parents who'd made this choice of an ordinary or low-performing secondary school were very highly educated compared to the national population in England, which is the reference point, I suppose. 83% of them had a degree, and a quarter of them, 25% of them, had some form of postgraduate qualification, many doctorates actually. So a very high proportion of them have been very geographically mobile. About 70% had moved to where they were now living quite recently, within the last 10 years. So a very geographically, perhaps relatively very highly mobile group. One surprise we got is we thought we would find a bunch of parents who were highly committed to the welfare state, to notions of welfare, to notions of comprehensive education on principle. There was some of that, but surprisingly little, actually. Very, very much in the minority of these parents. Could you say that it was something along the lines of, I believe in comprehensive schooling because it is a socialist principle, or I believe that everybody should go to the local school. That was very, very much a minority. I think another really significant area of findings, and by the way, we didn't just use Bourdieusian insights, we crossed over into psychosocial theorizing as well, and found that those things work quite well together, was the desire for a multicultural educational experience. This was a very, very big rationale for these parents. That is, put it crudely, they were choosing a school which would, in their eyes, prepare their young person for a diverse, multicultural world. In fact, not just multiculturally diverse, but socially diverse as well. They wanted their young person to have a form of capital that would equip them for fluency, ease in a variety of social settings. They often, by the way, railed against the privilege of selective secondary education and were against it without necessarily being politically sort of committed in that way. Okay, so that's some sort of a little bit of flavour there. I could mention a few other, perhaps one other thing. The very, very high proportion of these parents were governors of schools, primary and secondary. Many of them were a high proportion were chairs of governors, actually, much higher than we expected. And talking to them, they valued the opportunity to get close to the processes of schooling. We talk about that as a form of contribution, but also a form of surveillance. Okay. I'll say one other thing to complete this before we look at the examples of misrecognition in particular. Looking across the data, and we had quite a lot of, as you can imagine, a lot of interview data here, we came to the view that the best sort of model for summarising quite a lot of actions on the part of families and parents was a sort of investment metaphor, but a risky investment metaphor. So parents, because of the way they talked about their child and about education, they thought there was a lot to be gained, a hell of a lot to be gained by the child going to an ordinary local comprehensive school, but they recognised it was risky to do that. So as with, I mean, I don't know because I've never done it, but as I assume with a risky financial investment, you would stand to gain a lot, but it's very volatile, and you keep watch, wouldn't you? You keep looking at it every day to see that it was going okay. And that seemed to be a useful metaphor for quite a lot of the orientations that we gleaned through our data. Vigilance was necessary. Parents talked about being ready to pull out if they had to. It's quite a common phrase. As if they were placing their child actually as something to grow as an investment. So very interesting model there. Okay. I suppose misrecognition is what we need to get to. We should now. Example A of misrecognition. You can understand these parents' choices and decisions as a classic avoidance of misrecognition. So what do I mean by that? Well, I'll say this first. The identification and avoidance of a common misrecognition, that is, parents deciding not to be mainstream choosers, not to buy in to the dominant policy peddled view of choice and quality. They conceive the educational project, it's conceived in ways that takes it well beyond the idea of choice that's prevalent in mainstream policy, which I would call neoliberal and marketised policy. So school choice for them is something other. There's a lovely distinction here in Andrew Sayer's work. Andrew Sayer has a very good take on Bourdieu, a bit like Bev Skeggs' take. It kind of enriches areas of Bourdieu in useful ways. So what Sayer says about this is that choice and the market treats all preferences as basically the same. You will go for something if you think it's better, or you'll go for something else if you think that's better, as if you were buying washing machines, whatever. But Sayer points out that with things like education, there's a really crucial distinction between preferences and commitments. People have preferences, yes, but they also have commitments, they have values, they have stuff they believe in, even if it's not attached to mainstream politics or isn't always very visible. So, okay, so these parents, their educational project doesn't buy into mainstream views of choice and indeed quality. It avoids what I would call those common forms of misrecognition. You know, in that sense, it's sort of that double hermeneutic idea as well. They, like the schools actually, they know, these parents know that it's kind of about social class above all else. Sure, some kids, you know, do well from very deprived backgrounds. Of course they do. And sure, some kids from very privileged backgrounds nosedive and stay there, you know. Sure, but the tendency, the sociology shows, since, you know, it ever began, that there are strong tendencies. So avoiding that misrecognition, their child is going to be okay, you know, go to the school, it will give them that breadth of multicultural experience, it will give them loads of other things that will equip them well for life in a whatever modern society, and they'll be happy. So there we are, avoidance of misrecognition. But there's another form of misrecognition in here if you want to apply the concept in this way. So the second one is the certainty of trajectory of the child based on the imputation of brightness. A double hermeneutic and a mutual affinity between the needs of schools and the needs of middle-class families. Now let me explain that with a bit of, I'll just like to share a little bit of data with you. I could have done that with the other one, perhaps I'll come back to it, but certainly with this one. In one interview, we've been talking about whether, in retrospect, the choice of a school had been a good one to have made. Father: I feel vindicated. Mother: yes, me too. I do too. Father: in that because our feeling is we're not interested in results, we're not interested in percentages of A to C's. What we're interested in is what our own children are going to achieve. So it could be that a year group do appallingly, but if the teachers have given our children the opportunity to rise to their natural place and get the qualifications that they're capable of, a good teacher will work with children, and then if they have one bright child in the class, they should be able to take them where they need to go. By the way, when we wrote that quote out, we italicised the opportunity to rise to their natural place, we italicised one bright child in that class, and we italicised